years, I've gained so much from so many. Some amazing people in my life who have cared with boundless love. Eternally grateful I am to them. I'm also thankful to the teachers who have given without holding back. So, can I give something back? I certainly hope so. Hopefully, this will be helpful to some young physicians in their clinical journey and in their exam preparations. That for me would be amazing. Hi everyone, welcome. Today's presentation is going to be on anion gap concepts, specifically related to the serum anion gap. Urine anion gap will be discussed another day. So what is an anion gap? Why do we have an anion gap? And how do we utilize this anion gap to help us in differentiating various metabolic acidosis? This is what we would like to explore today. But before getting into that, I would like to clarify that the anion gap is a normal physiological process and everyone has a range of anion gap. That's one. The second one is there are two different anion gaps, one for the serum and one for the urine. Both of these have different formulas, but the underlying concepts of electroneutrality and equilibrium of ions are the same. What is electroneutrality and what is equilibrium of ions? Let's look into that. Alright, let's begin with the concept of electroneutrality. Sodium is the measured cation and chloride and bicarbonate are the measured anions. In the body, to maintain a normal physiological process, the total sum of cations have to be and are equal to the total sum of anions. So the measured cation sodium plus everything else being unmeasured cations are equal to the measured anions chloride plus bicarbonate plus everything else that's unmeasured anion. Thus, the anion gap reflects the difference between the measured cations minus the measured anions. We then incorporate the unmeasured elements into the formula and it's rearranged as shown here. Then, so when you rearrange the formula, you get a serum anion gap formula of sodium minus chloride plus bicarbonate equaling unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations. So the anion gap can be either the measured cation sodium minus chloride plus bicarbonate, or anion gap can be unmeasured anion minus unmeasured cation. So keep in mind that when it's the measured ions, it's sodium minus chloride plus bicarbonate, and when you use the unmeasured ions, it's unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations. Remember, when it's unmeasured, it's the anions that come first. Unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations. How do we reach that formula? I've shown it step by step. Having looked at the concept of electroneutrality, now let's delve into the second balancing act of ion equilibrium. What exactly is that? To maintain normal physiology, when an anion is either increased or decreased, there is a counterbalancing act of another anion going in the opposite direction. Similarly, when a cation changes, another cation changes in the opposite direction. Essentially, that's what the ionic equilibrium means. So in a HAGMA process, unmeasured anions such as sulfate, phosphate or hyporate increase, and to counterbalance that, a measured anion bicarbonate is lost. So the gap between the measured cation sodium and the measured anions bicarbonate and chloride is increased. So you get a higher anion gap metabolic acidosis. So in HAGMA, you have an unmeasured anion that increases, so a measured component, that's bicarbonate anion, is lost. So the gap is increased. Whereas in a NAGMA process, a measured anion chloride is retained, hence to balance that another measured anion bicarbonate is lost. So one measured anion is increased and another measured anion is lost. So the gap is balanced and it's maintained. So in a HAGMA and a NAGMA, that's the difference. I strongly believe that visual memory is very powerful, and towards that end, this is a visual demonstration taken from online resources depicting what we discussed in the previous slides. Here it shows in color the normal physiology and the gaps, HAGMA and NAGMA. Okay, essentially the formula is sodium minus chloride plus bicarbonate. That's the anion gap. Measured cations are more than the measured anions. That's why we have a gap. Though in total the anions and cations are equal, but measured sodium is more than the measured chloride and bicarbonate. Thereby the unmeasured anion makes up the gap and you get that gap in normal physiology. That's the first column. So you got sodium, the anion, sodium the cation plus unmeasured cations, plus on the other side you got chloride, bicarbonate and the unmeasured anion. We could see that the unmeasured anion encroach into the area of sodium, thus we get a gap in normal physiology. Now if you move to the third pair of columns, that's HAGMA. We see that unmeasured anions are increased in number, encroaching into the area of bicarbonate, thereby increasing the gap between sodium and chloride and bicarbonate put together on the anion side. So that gives us a HAGMA. If you look at the middle column, we see that the measured anion bicarbonate is less in number, and that space is taken by another measured anion chloride. Okay, so the gap remains the same and we get a NAGMA. This is the process of normal physiology, high anion gap and normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. This is another very effective colorful depiction of what we've discussed in the previous slide. I've just put this in place for you to have a look, and I've actually highlighted what's described there in small letters. I keep looking at it, and visual memory definitely helps. Another point that I would like to highlight is the NAGMA is described as a hypochloremic metabolic acidosis in literature, and that is because one measured anion bicarbonate is replaced by another measured anion chloride, and that we could see from our lab results, and thus we call it a hypochloremic metabolic acidosis, because that's something that we could demonstrate. This is not intended to be a discussion on etiopathogenesis. This is supposed to be physiology and understanding the physiological process, but I do believe that understanding the etiology of HAGMA actually helps us to remember the causes and understand the physiology and pathology as well. I'm not a great fan of mnemonics. I try to understand the underlying physiological process and see whether the facts stick to mind. That's always been the way I try to remember things. Here, if you do remember, the HAGMA is due to unmeasured anions increasing in number, encroaching into the space of bicarbonate, thereby increasing the gap between the measured cations and the measured anions. Unmeasured anions have taken up the place of bicarbonate. So if we look at the metabolic products that take up that space, that is unmeasured anion, in terms of normal physiology that have become abnormal pathology, it's ketoacidosis. So ketoacidosis is as in diabetic, starvation, or alcoholic. That's 3. And then it could be uremic acidosis, or it could be lactic acidosis. Those are the 5 causes of normal physiology that has become abnormal pathology. Then we do have 5 exogenous products that could behave as toxins. Into that category comes acetaminophen, that's paracetamol, acetyl salicylic acid, toluene glue sniffing, then we got ethylene glycol and methanol toxicity. Thus, we have 5 physiological processes that have become abnormal and then 5 external toxic products. That's how I remember. In terms of understanding and in terms of multiple choice questions, it's also important to know what the breakdown toxic products are. I've actually given a slide in relation to that. Have a look. It's very useful, and some of them have been repeated multiple choice questions, and that's in terms of ethylene glycol, which is actually I believe it is actually antifreeze material, and it is used as a recreational product as well, and it's come in multiple choice questions. So have a look; it will be helpful. Another thing to understand is uremic acidosis is not because of urea. Urea is actually electroneutral and is a base, and the breakdown product ammonium is a cation. So if that is a cation and if the urea is electroneutral, how do you get a high anion gap metabolic acidosis? The reason for that is the metabolic breakdown products are phosphate, sulfuric acid and hippurate, all of which are negative anions. That's important to understand and know from examination process as well. This is a clinical scenario of ethylene glycol poisoning, antifreeze, intoxication, a patient presenting to the ED with high anion gap metabolic acidosis, and the physician looking at the urine sample under microscope and finding oxalate crystals. We did look at ethylene glycol metabolic breakdown products. Oxalate was one of them. This has come as multiple choice scenarios as well. This is another slide of the ethylene glycol antifreeze scenario, just to re-emphasize. Have a look. Moving on to the hypochloremic NAGMA. Hypochloremic because when one measured anion is lost, another measured anion will take its place. Here bicarbonate is lost and chloride is retained. Hence hypochloremic NAGMA. Broadly speaking, NAGMA is divided into RTA and non-RTAs. Non-RTAs are pretty straightforward. Bicarbonate loss in the urine, thereby blood becoming acidotic. That's the non-RTAs. RTAs are type 1, type 2 or type 4. Type 2 RTAs are the proximal tubules defect in retaining the glomerular filtered bicarbonate. Hence, it's not a glomerular pathology, it's a defect in the PCT to reabsorb the bicarbonate. Hence, a base product is lost in the urine, acidifying the blood. Type 1 and type 4 are the distal tubules' inability to secrete hydrogen ion. It's important to remember the urine acid excretion equals urine ammonium chloride excretion. If we do remember that, then we would understand type 1 and type 4. Hydrogen ion needs to combine with ammonia to form ammonium, which combines with chloride to form ammonium chloride. A defect in ammonium chloride excretion would accumulate acid waste products in the body, thereby causing acidosis. Chloride is retained, and to compensate, another measured anion, bicarbonate, is lost, thereby also contributing to the acidosis and the ion equilibrium as well. I do plan to discuss renal tubular acidosis in detail in another session. Diarrhea being the main cause of non-RTA NAGMA, understanding the stool composition would be helpful. Looking at it, we understand that the stool has high components of the cations sodium and potassium, also anions bicarbonate and chloride. Thus, in diarrhea, we lose cations and anions in the stools, and the blood anion gap is maintained. Also, bicarbonate is lost in diarrhea, and an acidosis is created, having a normal anion gap. Metabolic acidosis in non-RTA causes. Understanding this would later help in understanding the urinary anion gap as well. It has got a different formula, and we will look at it in another session. This slide explains what I have discussed in the previous slide. Have a look to reinforce the idea. The NAGMA being mainly RTAs and non-RTA causes. Here I have detailed the non-RTA causes of NAGMA. It's still essentially correct that they are gastrointestinal bicarbonate loss, but I have given a bit more detail to that. Just to remember that secretory villus adenomas can cause NAGMA mechanism I have explained here. Also, why ureteroileostomy and ureterosigmoidostomy cause NAGMA. I have explained that as well. And then textbooks do describe cholestyramine and sevelamer as causes of NAGMA, which is important for us to keep in mind. As described in previous presentations, this would be the process I follow in analyzing acid-base pathologies. I would like to add that a smaller gap, both serum and urine, is another very useful process. Hopefully, I plan to do on NAGMA, urinary anion gap, and the osmotic gap analysis in another presentation in detail. This is just an introductory slide of the urinary anion gap. From what we've discussed about the anion gap process and physiology, have a look whether you could work out how the urinary anion gap could be useful. These are some of the topics I plan to discuss in the future presentations. If there are any particular topics that you would like to add, kindly let me know. So grateful to so many people. All I can say is thank you very much. If you liked it, kindly hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for listening.